Oh, I'm out of focus. Hi, folks. I think we're going to get started now. So my name is Connor Baton. I'm the secretary of the local radical independence group in Dundee, and I'm delighted to be chairing this session called These Islands in Common. Perhaps fittingly, I'm chairing it from the southeast of England, just at the end of a year-long exile in Cambridge. I'm going to try not to brag about the good weather we've been having. The main purpose of this session is to get radical independence supporters in Scotland talking with people in other parts of the islands. I know some people from Wales and from Ireland will be here today, and I really hope to hear from them about the state of the national movements there and how we might better work together against the British state, which, as we all know, opposes self-determination across the board. This is also an opportunity to hear from sympathetic voices in England, or perhaps some of the lesser known movements for sovereignty and self-determination within these islands. In Scotland, we want to internationalise the independence, to draw on the experience and support of our friends out with Scotland, and we also want to reciprocate. So hopefully this session, which is an hour long, will help us kind of start that process with our nearest neighbours. The floor is now open. This is an open-ended discussion. There's not going to be any long lead-off from me. So I'd like to invite people to maybe come in and share some thoughts on the questions. You know, what do we have in common? What can we learn from each other? And how can we work together? And of course, if people want to come in and just introduce themselves, that'd be very welcome as well. Hi, Alan. You're first off the bat.
Alan Boylan, Dundee RSP, RCF, and general activist. I think the important thing is we internationalise our struggle. It's local groups, not just RIC nationally, but local groups, meetable links with other local groups in Wales, Ireland, England, and overseas. Internationalism from below at group and city level, you build a stronger movement. You have stronger politics, a stronger understanding of your place in the world and humanity, and it can't be emphasised. Nationalism from below is the way to build a movement and our future. Thank you.
I know that we do have a few comrades from Welsh and Irish organisations here. Would any of you like to maybe introduce yourself and say a little bit about your organisation? Well, I'll maybe throw out another question then, because as folk will have seen from the media coverage of today's conference, one of the ideas that we put out is actually the idea of taking direct action to the streets of London and not to Scotland. For my part, as an activist with a great deal of interest in islands more widely, I think there's a really interesting opportunity with anything in London to link up, not only with people who are in Ireland and Wales, but potentially with the diaspora populations in London. So that's one of the things that we'll probably be discussing a little bit in the direct action workshop this afternoon. But I'm keen to hear perspectives from those out with Scotland as to even if we can have shared demands in such an action. Hi, Ellen.
Hiya.
Do you want to come in and introduce yourself?
Okay.
Yes, I can.
So my name's Eileen Howell, and I'm joining you from Pwllheli in North Wales. I'm active with Undod, which is an organisation in Wales that's calling for radical Republican independence for Wales, self-determination for our people, equality for all who live here. And hopefully by coming to the meeting today, I can just add our voice to the mix and see what's going on elsewhere, because cooperation between all of us here in England, Wales, Scotland, Ireland, Northern Ireland is so important, so that we can come together and have strength from cooperation and raise our voices and be heard.
Thanks, Eileen. I can maybe ask you, in Scotland, obviously, our big challenge is winning the right to a referendum. We had a period recently where we had quite strong public support, but no way to actually get a vote. I wonder how different you feel the situation is in Wales, where you have a Labour-devolved government. Do you think that poses obstacles to working together?
Yeah, so our battles in Wales are slightly different. We do have a Labour government that is slowly becoming less of a union promoting government. And a lot of that's down to things that have happened with COVID and that kind of thing. But it's a really slow process. And more Labour members are becoming pro-independence, and there's a lot of work going on there. But essentially, you know, we have a pro-union government, and the idea of a referendum is beyond our horizon at the moment. There's a lot of talk in different circles about looking at having a referendum not in this parliament but in the next parliament, and calling it ourselves, and then then setting it as a challenge to the government, kind of thing. We're calling it, we've got a majority support, and approaching it that way. But it's definitely a different battle, and we might be not quite as far along as you are in Scotland, but we're catching up really fast, and things are moving really quickly here. So it's it's a really interesting place to be at the moment, I think.
Thanks, Eileen. Does anyone else want to come in? Maybe just even to introduce yourself, explain your interest in. I'll bring in Gavin and then Johnny.
Hi, so I'm Gavin McCall. I live in Angus. Only really became involved in party politics after the Scottish independence referendum, after a lifetime of being sort of anarchist. But I think things are sort of at such a stage that we have to compromise and such like. But anyway, to me, I think the important thing here sometimes is that our sort of quest for independence, to me, is not about nationalism, but I think that's often how it's seen, and it's seen as like a sort of maybe seen outside Scotland as a selfish thing being done by Scottish people for themselves in some way against the interests of working people in other parts of the UK. But clearly, to me, the reasons that we want independence are about breaking up the UK state for all the many faults that it has and the interests that it serves, and breaking up the UK, Scottish independence, English independence, Welsh independence, Northern English independence, whatever you want to call it. We all need it, and we should all be working together to do it, and coordinating, not having separate campaigns. If you like, it's not just about Scottish independence. It's about independence for all the people that are currently trapped in the UK state, which we know serves a very limited elite and doesn't really serve any of us. And personally, like, although being in the Green Party, I find sometimes speaking with our colleagues in the Green Party England and Wales, their whole language can be, so you'll hear things like, one of the downsides is the potential breakup of the UK. So these people are supposed to be on our side. So how do we, and I know, like, I've been in similar discussions, what was it, Another Europe is Possible, and there was a heavy feeling from sort of, not so much Welsh people in the room, but English-based people in the room, that Scottish independence was like an anti-internationalist or splitting the working class or something. So we somehow need to work together and get past that sort of perception, I think. Sorry, I know I've talked too long. I apologise.
Not at all, Gavin. Thanks for that.
Thank you. Hi everyone, I'm Johnny and I'm from the Highlands, and I wanted to say, in my opinion, when you think about these different parts of the UK, or nations of the UK, if you want to put it that way, and they're all campaigning for independence from the same state, the UK, and it kind of makes it easier if there's a handful of different campaigns. It makes it easier for the UK state and harder for us. But if these various campaigns in Scotland, in Wales, potentially in England, Irish reunification, if these link up, then that, many hands make light work, basically. And Alan Boylan was going on about internationalism from below. And I'd like to sort of say what I understand by that, because there's sometimes easier when you're wanting to find something and tell the opposite. So there was like a famous debate a few years ago with Leanne Wood from Wales and Nicola Sturgeon hugging each other on national television, which is all fine and well, but that's internationalism from above, basically, in my opinion. And internationalism from below would be at grassroots level, something like today, but obviously this is more of a talking event to get to know each other than, what can we build on from here and keeping in touch. So that's what I wanted to share with you. Thank you very much. I'll pass to the next speaker.
Thanks, Johnny. I'm going to bring in Paul and then Craig.
Hi, I'm Paul. I'm a socialist for Glasgow. I think a discussion like this is really important because, national independence movements or democratic movements can have such a stimulating effect on other movements in other places. Like, I think about the way that, all the struggles against Portuguese colonialism in the end hastened the fall of Portuguese fascism in the metropole itself. The Angolan and the Mozambique wars contributed to really, destabilizing Portuguese fascism, and that allowed the working class to, rise up in the end and bring that regime down. And the way that, say, the Vietnam War, the war against American imperialism there, that independence struggle stimulated movements all over the world, not just national independence movements, but also so many movements in the USA got such a boost from basically doing Vietnam solidarity, but that also generated a lot more, I guess, radical action all over the place in America. So I think, one struggle in one place can have knock-on effects. I mean, for example, I think the Welsh struggle for independence is beginning to pick up speed and taking a lot of lessons and a lot of knowledge from us in Scotland. So I think honestly as well, we could probably give the English working class a bit of a kick up the arse if we encourage them to, because I think the struggle for democratic rights is something that we can show the way forward. If the Scottish working class and the Welsh working class are fighting for their right to choose, we definitely need to get the English working class involved, but we can show the way and say, well, here's how we're doing direct action, civil disobedience. You join us in this struggle and, take action against your Tory government. So I think it's so important to look at the linkages. Yeah.
I'm Craig Lewis. I'm a member of the Public Socialist Platform, RIC, but I also am a member still of Left Unity Wales, and I've been working with them for some time. I was politically active in Wales and in the Welsh trade union movement for quite a long time. In fact, more years than I care to remember. I just wanted to agree actually with Elin when she spoke that I think there is a lot of things that we can learn from each other. I think one of the differences in Wales at the moment is, as she said, that Drakeford is, and the Welsh Labour Party is a very different phenomenon to the Scottish Labour Party, that's for sure. But Drakeford's position seems to be to support a deepening of devolution. And to my mind, and I think we've had these debates in Scotland, and I'm sure that Welsh comrades can learn from us. But to my mind, what that's about is precisely not breaking up the British state. It's actually defending the British states, if you like, because we're talking about handing down devolution from the state structures, the very anti-democratic state structures, I would argue, in the British centralised state, and I think our Welsh comrades are well advised to take that on quite significantly, and to argue, as I think it was Gavin or somebody mentioned, for a grassroots approach from below. I think that's the one way in which we can, if you like, capitalize on the breakup of the British state, which I'm 72 now, and I think we're closer to the breakup of the British state than I can ever remember. and a grassroots Republican approach from below, as people have been talking about, is the one thing that we have in common across the various components of the British state, and can actually build the kind of solidarity that we're talking about. So anyway, I just wanted to say fraternal greetings to everybody from other countries. Just say my piece. So thanks very much.
Thanks very much, Craig. I'm going to bring in Kirstine and then Maddie.
I'm Kirstine Fraser. I'm an activist, a trade unionist, and still somehow an SNP party member, having held quite a few office bearer positions over the years. And I was really excited to see a session like this one today, because I'm going to say this as someone who is a member of political party. I think we over-focus times on political parties being the drivers of change within our communities and across the wider nation. I think there's a real over-focus on national movement that leads to a neglect of local collective action from the grassroots, which in my experience can be much more reflective of people's daily lives. I find local organisations are much more diverse and reflective of the countries and areas that we live in than, to be frank, national political movements. And tribalism, I think, can be such a huge issue when it comes to cross-organisation, or dare I say it, party cooperation. Hopefully we're starting to see a shift in that in Scotland, but for anyone else kind of in other areas of these islands across the kind of wider UK, all I would say from Scotland is don't fall into the trap I think we did for many years, which is it's very much about political parties and it's all or nothing. You know, that's not true. The other kind of thing I would really like to say is the British state has always been very, very good at the old tactics of divide and conquer. So we as activists in our separate movements need to be aware of that and counter it, and be very aware that there is more that unites us than divides us. We may have differences, but chances are there's more that's going to unite us across Northern Ireland, England, Wales, and wider internationally than anything else. And much of what we encounter across the islands, whether it be rural issues in Scotland to rural issues in Wales, England, and Northern Ireland, share a lot of commonality due to the centralisations of powers and indifference to issues at the local level. And there is a tendency, I would argue, that everything needs a big bespoke national solution, when in reality, and I will say this is anecdotal, I have found communities have a lot of the ideas, have a lot of the experience, and this information and solidarity is something we really, really need to foster. It needs to be at the heart of everything we do. So I hope to kind of see a lot more of this. And nationalism and national party politics and movements do fall into these traps very, very often, and seemingly are quite condescending to localized movements or kind of movements like what we're trying to do today with RIC. So all I would say is, despite the fact we may have differences, there may be things that we vehemently disagree on. There will be more that unites us than divides us. So thank you very much for organising this today. I'm very excited.
Thank you very much. I think we agree entirely, and you're definitely in the right place. Maddie, on you go.
Yeah, I just wanted to sort of talk about, I agree with everything that Kirstine just said there, that especially about party politics. I just wanted to reiterate that. So I won't go into any of that. But what I would like to sort of think about and hear thoughts about is the issues of power, basically. So, you know, we talk about this right to self-determination, democracy, and building the grassroots, and building this internationalism from below. So what does that look like? How do we build power from below that we need? Like how do we sort of get those ideas from the local level and coordinate on a national or international level, really, between these movements? And what does that look like, basically? And what problems or what issue are we organizing around to get people interested in this? I don't have the answers to these questions, but I'd like to hear thoughts from people as well. How do we address the power and take the power that we need and build the power of the grassroots.
Very much, Maddie. Again, the floor is open. I don't think there's anyone in the. Ewan, hi.
Yeah, hi. I'm Ewan. I'm from Edinburgh. I was actually about a month too young to vote in the 2014 independence referendum, but it, I think, was very formative for myself and people my age, because about half of my year group in school could vote. So I think everyone was politicized. Everyone was really like talking about it all the time, constantly, every single day. So that's kind of where I came from. And since then, I've been active in like grassroots trade unions like the IWW, as well as sort of occasionally active in Living Rent. But now I think part of the reasons why I came to this session was because the possibility of working together between these islands, and like combining the strengths, and learning from each other's weaknesses of like the Welsh and Scottish and Irish movements, I think it can be really important. One of the things I'm interested in us working together to challenge is something that I believe, I think someone mentioned it earlier. I've completely forgotten their name, but the so-called the greater devolution, offers of greater devolution as an attack on independence, or the classic sort of so-called federalism. I think what would be quite cool is if through us, our separate independence movements collaborating, we can form like a genuine argument and a genuine like movement kind of against this sort of false federalism that's often offered by I would say mostly the Labour Party sort of leadership, as well as its fans in some parts of the English and to an extent other parts of the UK left. So I'm interested to hear ideas about challenging federalism in the British nationalist sense, and actually working towards meaningful cooperation across these islands. Thank you.
Thanks, Ian. The floor is open. I wonder if any of our Welsh comrades, or perhaps Craig, if you want to come back in on the topic of devolution and federalism. Hi both. I'll take Daniel first because you've not spoken, and then Eileen.
Thanks, Connor. Hi everyone, I'm Dan. I'm living in Cardiff at the moment. I'm from the South Wales Valleys initially. I'm a member of INDOD, which is what Ellen spoke about. And I'm a member of Valleys Underground too. So for those of you who don't know, a kind of like Marxist organization that kind of is rooted in direct action in communities, and pro-Welsh independence too. I think it was Iwan who just made the point about federalism, and I thought that linked quite well to I think it was Maddie who was talking about power, and how we kind of approach the power dynamics before by the union. And I think through the direct action that we do through groups like Valleys Underground, we're kind of giving communities and people in them a renewed sense of power, and saying like, maybe you've been neglected by the government or the council, and here's the power. You don't need approval from these people to make a community better. So we've recently been helping out with restoring a miners' institute in the valleys, and I think we've showed up. We've just been kind of renovating it and stuff, and people from the community have showed up, out of the blue, and helped out. They could be, old men who have fond memories of the institute before it got run down, or it could be, kids showing up on their bikes and chipping in. And I think it's just such a great example of showing these communities that have been neglected, they're impoverished places, that the power lies with them. They don't need to ask for permission for anyone. And I think those kind of, the microcosm of that can be translated into like a political idea. Why are we asking the British state for permission? Why are we asking the British state to extend our furlough if we want to go, a different way to them? And I think by showing people that at home, they have the power to make a change, hopefully that kind of trickles up to the way they vote and, the political parties that they might be a member of. I also found the discussions about the stereotype of the nationalism is quite small-minded and quite kind of inward-looking. And I think we have to turn that on its head. And with groups like INDOD, we have links to the Zapatistas in Chiapas. We do with Valleys Underground, we have links with Scotland and Ireland. And I think, the idea that, okay, you're going to strengthen your communities and you're going to have this wonderful international outlook where you meet people from all over. I think if you combine them, you put forward a vision of independence for Scotland and for Wales. That's like irresistible. People really, that's something that people want. And I think, by a combination of those two, we can really make some great progress. So yeah, thanks for listening. Thanks for everyone who's contributed so far. Really important discussion. So thank you.
Thanks very much, Dan. And that sounds incredible about the Miners Institute. It's a shame that I know that you're going away to watch the football at 2 o'clock, because I think that would be a really interesting thing to bring into our workshop and physical spaces this afternoon. And I know we'll be hearing from some comrades in the Basque Country and elsewhere that are involved in similar kind of projects. Definitely want to bring that energy to Scotland. So thanks, Dan. Eileen and then Craig.
It's really interesting, actually, because this question of deeper devolution and stuff is being talked about organisations at the moment, and how do we vocalise and give a structure to the threat that we see that is to independence, and make it clear that that's actually a step forward in a way, if you see what I mean. So that's a really interesting one, and it's having solidarity and of people from all over these islands in that conversation would really strengthen our position as a nation, I think, in resisting this idea that deeper devolution is going to give us what we need when clearly it isn't. And the idea of independent communities is something that become quite prevalent really in my work, in my day-to-day work. I work with community, with organisations like and that kind of thing, and it's create independent communities and work from the bottom up on it. Developing in Wales at the moment is it's called Mudiad Cenedlaethol Cymru. So the hope is that it'll be a coming together of all different communities, create communities, looking at how do we create a path to government that's actually vocalising the needs of the people in their communities and developments, I think, and creating that idea of it without going first to politics and politicians is something that is really exciting.
Gillian. Craig, do you want to come back in?
Only very briefly, because I think both Ellen and, sorry, I've forgotten, Daniel, have both said everything I was probably going to say. And it was really good to hear that as well, because I think we in Scotland tend to kind of be dismissive about federalism when it's mentioned. It's usually mentioned by Gordon Brown, and does these days is to address that, and it's a real. I think the debate's moved on, but it can be very seductive, and I know that it's been raised by Drakeford in Wales, and I just reiterate the point I made. It is actually an attack on devolution. Devolution is actually an attack on independence. It's a way of heading off independence, and it's a defense of the British state and the British state structures. It's absolutely correct that what we want to do is to try and empower working people's lives, both in the workplace and in their communities. And that's what we support independence for, not because we're nationalists. It's that giving power to the working class, both over their economic and on their social lives. So I think we've got to emphasize this all the time. And devolution, extended home rule, whatever you want to call it, is actually a diversion from that. I mean, we should be very clear about it. To be honest, with young people like I've just heard, I think we're in good hands, to be honest. But anyway, thanks for letting me back in, Connor. Cheers.
Of course, Craig, no worries. And that just goes for anyone. If anyone wants to come back in, maybe reflect on some of the points that have been raised, you're more than welcome to. I think based on what I can see from the list of people here, that some of our friends in Ireland weren't able to attend today. I just wanted to say that I got a couple of really supportive messages from people in the north of Ireland, particularly reflecting on that in the 2014 referendum campaign. You know, it was very clear that there were people in Scotland who didn't want to, who thought it would complicate the issue if they were seen as cooperating with Republicans and nationalists in Ireland. And they were reflecting on the fact that that appears to have changed in the years since. And I think there is, in my opinion as well, that there's new openness in Scotland, but in Ireland, also in Wales, to working together in a way that we haven't before. So I think that unlocks a really interesting opportunity for how a future referendum campaign might be quite different. And you know, I wouldn't rule out the possibility of perhaps referendums taking place in different parts of the UK at the same time. That might actually be a tactical advantage to us. I would like to know what people think about that. Kirstine, do you want to come back?
Yeah, I just kind of wanted to kind of address a point I could kind of see that's kind of coming up in the chat, and I think this is a kind of a major stumbling block, I think, for us in Scotland. So I really would just kind of say, for anyone who's kind of looking to Scotland for all kind of ideas, this is, I think, a stumbling block, and that I think we over focus on trying to convince kind of the left in England of actually we're not kind of what you think of as, you know, like when it comes to being pro-independence. It's, you know, I think they have a very incorrect idea of what the independence movement as a whole in Scotland looks like, and I think they have an idea of it being something as Brigadoon and everyone's tartan Tories, and you know, it's a very insular movement. I don't think they really understand how internationalist it is and how it's very much built on, you know, kind of local kind of collectivized movements. But I do think we have to get away from like, oh, we're having to convince, you know, the English left. That's a waste of time and energy. You just have to convince enough people who vote that these ideas have value. And this is the major thing I would say about obviously being a pro-independence movement. And again, another trap I would argue we fell into a lot of times in 2014 and in the run-up to 2014. This isn't about political parties' vision. It's about our vision. And I say that as, you know, as people, what we want to see from our country, what we want to see globally. This is about us as a collective and what we're kind of willing to fight for and seize as a collective. Not really political parties, they're just vehicles, and general kind of movements are vehicles as well, but it all comes down to what is important to us. That's the important thing. What makes a difference to our lives, our communities' lives? You know, the blocks of society that hold us together, whether that's the NHS or whether that's, you know, a national care agency. These are all things that ordinary people have made an argument for and stuck up for. There'll be the same issues across these islands with all the other kind of different localized movements. That's what we need to remember, not getting hung up on what the Guardian thinks, I'm afraid.
Thanks, Kirstine. And Rory, and you want to talk about confederalism?
Yeah, I'm sorry I was a bit late because I was in another meeting, but so I'm really sorry if I'm covering ground that's already been covered. But one of the ways of pushing back against federalism, I think, is just how top down it's going to have to be. There's no British political subject that can make federalism from the ground up. Britain is a kind of mess of different national political systems that are stitched together once every few years by a general election. There's no real collective subjectivity that all moves together that can make federalism happen from below. We know for a fact, even if federalism did happen, it would be a top-down technocratic fix. It wouldn't solve some of these deep underlying territorial problems. And I think there's a strong argument to be made that whether you want to call nationalists or self-determination, constituent nation of the UK, can kind of reclaim some of the idea of collective solidarity across these islands through the idea of confederalism. You know, not a vision of independence that really does split up the countries and ends any kind of political cooperation, but a union that's based on sovereignty rising from the bottom up. The kind of vision that should have been there for Europe, and I think would work pretty well in Britain. We are going to need to cooperate closely across borders because we'll be part of a British-wide economy. You constantly hear how much trade there is across the borders and so on. And I think giving that some kind of political forum is not completely opposed to arguing for Scottish independence. And confederalism, where power rises upwards from each territorial unit, I think is a far better vision of the same principles that underpin federalism than federalism itself. And I think it's worth developing that model and developing an idea of how these countries can work together in a kind of constituted way, so that we're not simply dismissing federalism, because I think there's arguments in federalism. It allows unionists on the left to frame the union in benevolent ways based on solidarity that it's difficult to have an answer to if you're just arguing for independence. And I think it's saying, look, if you want some kind of union, political union based on mutual respect and equality, it has to start with sovereignty going to each of those units first. And that's what confederalism is about. It's about choosing to join together on a basis that preserves your independence and your capacity for self-determination. So I'd be interested in people's thoughts on confederalism as a political model for the former UK. And I think it's worth digging into a bit more, basically.
Thanks, Rory. I see a few people in the chat are responding to this. I wonder if anyone wants to come in, maybe say a little bit about what they think of the idea of a confederal model as opposed to a federal one.
Hi, thanks. Yeah, I mean, I won't say very much. I just caught the end of what you were saying, Rory, because I've been skipping between different sessions here. But yeah, I mean, I've been a long-term advocate of confederalism. I think the important thing to understand, it was clear from what you were saying, a lot of people don't understand it, is that confederalism presumes independence. It presumes that Scotland, England, Wales, have their say. It can also, of course, presume much greater regional autonomy as well. And it's then, rather than trying to produce a federal system which will always be dominated by the larger partners, it starts from a basis of equality and engagement. But it also starts from what I think is a radical perspective, which is that independence requires interdependence. It's not about isolating ourselves or going alone, but it's asking what can be the best ways that we can work together. The big challenge, of course, for confederalism is that, is the England problem. England is where I'm from. I moved to Scotland 11 years ago. There's very little evidence that England wants a genuine partnership of equals. But of course, England doesn't have a say. It's dominated by Westminster like the rest of us. I think the Northern Independence Party, other people on the left in England, have an opportunity to do something they haven't done before, which is, first of all, to theorise the state and to recognise that the UK is a massive problem for everything that they're trying to achieve. And secondly, to say what better pattern of relationship within these islands could actually develop, with Scottish independence perhaps really creating the momentum and the conditions for that. Because we do need better patterns of relationship. We do need each other. One of the things I sort of say very often to people, down south particularly, is that the UK and Britain are not the same thing. The UK is a state, a union state with a particular history, a particular dominance, which I think is now unworkable in any really progressive way. But actually Britain is a social, cultural, historical, thing. It's a family thing. We're connected geographically by these islands. What do we do with that? So I think one of the questions that we can ask radically about independence for Scotland is, what would an independent Scotland's offer to be to the rest of these islands? What would its offer be to England of a better way forward? How can we forge relations? A radical independence would open those kind of possibilities. So I think this is really worth talking about. Final comment is that in terms of winning over people who are reluctant to go for independence because they think it somehow means that, we're sacrificing Britain, we're breaking Britain up, we're destroying everything. Actually, confederalism shows what kind of pattern, negotiated pattern of better relationships can follow, and that actually you can't have those unless you do actually break with the UK state and create a different approach.
Thanks, Simon. See, Rory, you want to come back in?
Just on the England problem, to degenerate into Anglophobia, but it would be an issue. It's something really worth thinking about when federalism comes up, that this isn't something that should be entirely dismissed, precisely because even after independence, sharing an island with a country so much bigger than us, that is speaking with one big single booming voice, that we know will not necessarily be politically progressive, is something worth thinking about. And this is why I think that supporters of Scottish independence should be working much more closely with supporters of English regionalism, because breaking up England is a huge part of this, I think.
Yeah.
That a lot of the things that we complain about in Scotland are part of the arguments for independence are really about the size of England, the relative size of England. And in a way, if Labour were smart, they would realise that one of the most likely ways of fixing all these problems is by breaking up England, rather than giving Scotland more powers. And I think it would be good for us, would be good for an independent Scotland if England was a bunch of regions that were federally constituted themselves.
Yeah.
With which an independent Scotland could make alliances and things. I'm thinking of some kind of medieval Civil War kind of situation. But in terms of economic cooperation, I mean, Alex Niven's book, New Model Island, is really good on this stuff. In terms of economic cooperation, social cooperation, and cultural links, I think it would be really valuable to have an English regionalism as part of a radical independence agenda. And that's where cross-border cooperation, again, seems really useful.
I'll bring Simon back in, but I want to bring in Johnny first.
Yeah, thanks very much. I just kind of wanted to kind of really say it was kind of really interesting to kind of hear about, I suppose, the England question, because I think that's an area that I think we in Scotland misunderstand. I don't know if anyone else who is anywhere elsewhere in the rest of the kind of islands feels that way, but I do think there's a bit of a fundamental misunderstanding in how we approach, I suppose, forget the East Lothian question, but the England question. And I think the identity of being English, and I say this as someone who has English family members and also has a husband who is, half English and has still quite an English father. His identity is still, I'm English, I just happen to live in Scotland, and it's still kind of that lingering kind of idea of like, I'm still British. I mean, that's waning, but I think we misunderstand the kind of power of the hegemony of Westminster. And I say that with absolutely no hint of irony, given that many of us have issues with Westminster governments. But pretty much all the power, as has been very much kind of correctly pointed out in this session excellently by Simon and others, is that Westminster holds basically the sway of power in England. But there is this kind of issue where people don't necessarily see Westminster as, I suppose, the Parliament of power. They just resent it. So, and we make the mistake, I would argue, in kind of the other kind of nations that make up these islands, of thinking that people in England are absolutely happy with that arrangement. I don't think they are, in all honesty, but I don't think there's any actual kind of organisation other than letting it be hijacked by right-wingers and other dangerous political forces. We just kind of leave it to its own devices and it goes disastrously wrong, I would argue. Thank you.
Thanks very much. And Ewan, I think you'll get the final word for our lunch break.
Yeah, no, I was originally intending to ask this as an open question, but I don't think there's enough time for anyone to answer. But I was just thinking in terms of, like, obviously we've been talking kind of quite a lot, like, theoretic in a fairly abstract sense, but I was more wondering about sort of thinking sort of about practical steps that we could leave here for actually building greater links between the movements of these islands. And I think one of the things that I was thinking of, at least, and it might be worth leaving some suggestions in the chat, was like permanent communications. Like, I know a lot of groups will have like chat rooms and like various like Discord or like various other kinds of servers. Maybe getting members from each into each other's things to establish permanent communications. But something I've also found from stuff like my experience in the IWW and also in Living Rent, and is that quite a good way of building solidarity between groups is to put on stuff like training for each other, stuff like media skills, direct action experience, legal skills like workplace organization, these sort of things. I think that might be a good idea, is potentially organizing trainings or organizing events where we talk about our experiences in our different contexts, understanding each other's contexts, and then taking those lessons from both successes and failures and being able to put them into practice in our own contexts. Also, I am a bit of a fan of the idea of get a social gathering, socially distanced, of course, in London. I think it might be interesting. It could, I think, being somewhere physical when it's safe would be quite a good way to like build those connections between us and also us in Scotland, Wales, and Ireland, and also with the English leftists that may support our cause. So, thank you.
I think that is probably the perfect point to leave this on, because yeah, I do want to say a big thanks to everyone who joined us from organisations like Indod and Valleys Underground, people in all parts of these islands, and including those who couldn't be here today but sent messages of support. I think to take forward in a serious and organised way. So yeah, thanks to everyone who contributed. I really enjoyed this discussion. I hope it's just the start of many discussions like this. I love the idea of doing training. And even if you're out with the UK, out with Scotland, if you sign up to the Radical Independence mailing, which is on the website at ric.scot, I'm sure we'll use that to circulate some information about how we take this forward in the months ahead. So it's now time for our lunch break. Thanks everyone for taking part today.